everybody, my name is Julianne, and today I'll be reading Mr. Clumsy by Hargreaves. It was a nice morning, the sun was shining, the trees were full of singing birds, everybody outside was awake and smiling, but in a run-down little house in the middle of a field, somebody was still asleep. Can you guess who it was? His alarm clock rang. Ring, ring! Mr. Clumsy reached to turn his alarm clock off. One touch, and he knocked it on the floor. Oops, he said, that's the third alarm clock I've broken this week. As you might have guessed, Mr. Clumsy was a very clumsy fellow. Just like me, how silly. He got out of bed and turned on the radio. The knob came off in his hand. Oops, said Mr. Clumsy. That is the second radio I've broken this month. Mr. Clumsy went downstairs. He took a letter out of his mailbox and went to the kitchen to make breakfast. Mr. Clumsy took a slice of bread out of his bread basket and popped it into the toaster. Then he turned around to open his letter, but it wasn't on the table where he'd left it. Can you guess where it was? It was in the toaster, browning nicely. Mr. Clumsy fished the letter out of the toaster. Ouch, he said, dropping it. It's hot. As he bent down to pick it up, he banged his head on the table and ended up head first in the bread basket. Mr. Clumsy is a very clumsy fellow. In fact, he's the clumsiest fellow in the world. Later that morning, after he'd managed to get the bread basket off his head, Mr. Clumsy went to town, shopping. First things first, he said, and went into the bank to get some money. He tripped up the steps. He tripped into the bank. He knocked down the banker. You are, said the banker, my clumsiest client. Oops, said Mr. Clumsy. Mr. Clumsy went to the butcher shop. Morning, Mr. Butcher, he said cheerfully. Morning, Mr. Clumsy, said the butcher. What can I get for you today? I'll take some of those right there, said Mr. Clumsy. He pointed to some nice fat sausages. But, being Mr. Clumsy, he managed to trip and ended up with a sausage necklace. Mr. Clumsy's next stop was the supermarket. Just inside the door was a huge pile of canned soups. Exclaimed Mr. Clumsy. Soup would be perfect for supper tonight. Can you guess what happened next? Did Mr. Clumsy pick a can from the top of the pile? Oh no, not Mr. Clumsy. Cans went flying and falling everywhere. Oops, he cried. On his way home, Mr. Clumsy called on Farmer Brown for some fresh eggs. He smiled at the farmer and walked over to shake his hand. But being Mr. Clumsy, he managed to trip and fall, bringing Farmer Brown down with him. Splash! Oops, said Mr. Clumsy as they landed in the duck pond. Next time, said Farmer Brown, sitting in the duck pond, why don't you let me deliver your eggs to you? Why, thank you very much, replied Mr. Clumsy. Don't mention it, muttered the soggy farmer. Mr. Clumsy went home, drying off as he walked. First things first, he said, and went to take his bath. But as he stepped into the tub, he slipped on the soap, did 2 flips, and ended up with his head in the clothes hamper. Oops, he said, the muffled voice of Mr. Clumsy. Later, he managed to get downstairs for supper. Soup from the market, sausages from the butcher shop, and eggs from the farm. Or soup from the saucepan that had boiled over, sausages from the frying pan that had caught fire, and eggs, very, very, very scrambled eggs. Delicious, he said, leaning back in his chair. Crash! Oops, said Mr. Clumsy, and went to bed. He leaned over to turn off the lamp beside his bed, and... oops! And that was Mr. Clumsy by Hargreaves.